we're good to go. There won't be. Right. All right, let's begin with prayer. Dear Father, we are so humbled and thankful to be in your presence this day, to come together, even in this bad weather situation, to assemble ourselves, to learn more of your will and your way, to memorialize Christ and his sacrifice for the remission of our sins, purchasing us back from a fate of sin and death, and giving us the hope of the eternal life. We thank you so much for blessing us this week and keeping us all safe. We pray that you will continue to do so. We pray that those that are not able to be with us today because of the weather or because of illness or sickness or whatever the reason, we pray that you be with them, uplift them, and comfort them in their struggles. We all struggle with sin and temptation, Father. We pray that you be with each and every one of us in our lives and in the things that we struggle with. Help us and strengthen us to better equip ourselves to ward off the world's temptations and to live for you, to keep ourselves sanctified and separated apart from the world. We pray, Father, that you would be with us this day as we look into your word, open our hearts and minds, that we can understand clearly and better prepare ourselves to serve you in this life, and that the things that we do will bring glory to you. Forgive us of our sins and shortcomings, Father, as we stand before you this day to worship and study, that all that we do may be acceptable in your sight. Pray these things through Christ's name. All right, chapter 18, verse 28. We touched on 28. There you go, Cody. We touched on 28 last week, where Jesus was brought before Pilate. In today's study, I went back into some of the Synoptic Gospels and looked there, and in between one of the times where they brought Peter, Peter's last denial was on 27. That's where they had Jesus before Annas and Caiaphas, and John doesn't go into a lot about Jesus in front of Caiaphas. Apparently, John, like all the rest of the Jews, recognized Annas as the high priest, and his inquisition of Jesus was more pertinent to John's story of the situation than it was the Synoptic Gospels. They go into a little more detail, but John takes him straight from the courtyard of Annas and Caiaphas directly to Pilate here in verse 28. Verse 28, then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. We talked about this a little bit last week, where they took him to Pilate into the praetorium, which is the governor's hall, or the hall of judgment. And they took him early. This trial at Caiaphas and Annas' courtyard, which was not the temple, it was their living quarters, basically, took place through the night, apparently all night long, into early morning hours. And they took him straight into Jerusalem, into Pilate's hall, and it was somewhere between 3 and 6 a.m., early in the morning. Said that they wouldn't go in. We touched on this last week. They wouldn't go into the judgment hall because it was a dwelling of Gentiles. The Jews felt that if they went into the home or the dwelling of a Gentile, it would make them unclean for the Passover feast, that they couldn't take Passover if they defiled themselves by going into a Gentile's home. We talked about what things that would defile them in a Gentile's home. They
Passover feast consisted of unleavened bread, and the Gentiles always use leaven in their bread, which is something to make it rise. But also um, they had possibly remains of dead people. They would sometimes have the bones of their dead ancestors or their dead children inside their home, and it would defile a Jew to be around anything dead or any dead person. So they wouldn't go into the into Caiaphas's, to Pilate's judgment hall because it was a dwelling of the Gentiles. Most of this was more tradition than fear of touching anything unleavened or touching anything dead. It was just tradition for them, more than anything else. If you do a study on the Jews, more of their laws were tradition than anything else. They weren't so much laws; they were traditions, things that they had kept throughout the years, or tried to they tried to bind tradition on people as law. A lot of that was just simply tradition. Pilate then went out unto them and said, "What accusation bring you against this man?" So the Jews had to state their formal charges against Jesus. Excuse me. One thing that I wanted to touch base on here is in between the time that Pilate first took Jesus in and or first started the hearing here or the trial, at some point in time he sent him to Herod Antipas. Let's go back to Luke chapter 23, verses 6 through 15 tells us. Sometime during the trial of Jesus before Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas. And it doesn't touch on that in John, but I think it's important. So let's go back and read chapter 23 and we'll start in verse 1 of Luke chapter 23. And the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate. This is where they brought him to Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ the King." And Pilate asked him, saying, "Art thou King of the Jews?" And he answered and said, "Thou sayest it." Then said Pilate to the chief priest and to the people, "I find no fault in this man." And they were the more fierce, saying, "He stirred up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place." And when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. So when he found out that Jesus was a Galilean, this is what he did. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. So Herod and Pilate were both at Jerusalem at this time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. So Herod was glad to see Jesus, or excited to see Jesus, because he thought he was going to see a miracle or some wonder that Jesus might do. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod, with his men of war, set him at naught and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. So if nothing else, Jesus brought these two guys together to be friends. Isn't that strange under a circumstance? But I just thought that was interesting that Pilate tried to, everything in his power, not to convict Jesus of anything worthy of death. He found out he was in Pilate's. He was a Galilean, and tried to send him to Pilate's jurisdiction to get to Herod's jurisdiction. Sent him to Herod to get Herod to see about him. And Herod wouldn't have anything to do with him. Sent him back to Pilate. So they couldn't. He was like a stain on the robe that they just couldn't get rid of. They just didn't, neither one of them wanted to have anything to do with him because it was a no-win situation for both of them. There's no way that they could win with this situation. And neither one of them, here's the thing, neither one of them wanted to rule over something that involved the Jewish affairs. We talked about this before. When Rome conquered an empire, they would instill Roman rule and Roman governors to govern the daily dealings of everybody in the territory, but they left the people to rule themselves as far as their own affairs went. As long as the people that were in their dominant area, as long as they didn't get outside of what Romans considered to be a reasonable framework, then they just let them rule themselves. And the Jews had freedom to judge over anything in their territory, or pretty much rule as the Jews had always ruled among their people, except putting anybody to death. If anybody was sentenced to death, it had to come before a Roman court, and it had to be Romans that put them to death. We talked about this last week. They wanted to kill Jesus, but we also spoke about how the Jewish law was stated as far as putting someone to death. How did they kill anybody? How'd they kill Stephen? They stoned him. If you were worthy of death in the Jewish court, and it's funny, today the Islam nation does the same thing. They'll stone people for certain crimes, for adultery, or if you're a thief or anything like that. The Islamic nation will still stone you to death. So they fall back on the Old Testament law to rule their nations. But the Jews would have stoned him to death, but they didn't want to kill him. Well, they did want to kill him, but they couldn't kill him because then they would have been liable for his death, and the Roman courts would have put them to death for killing somebody outside of Roman jurisdiction. Pilate, 29, Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusation bring ye against this man? In verse 30, they answered and said unto him, if he were not a malefactor, we would not have delivered him up to thee. So they didn't really give him an answer. It was a vague response. He asked them for a charge, and they said, if he weren't a criminal, we wouldn't have brought him to you. That's not an answer. He's got to, in a court of law, you got to convict him of something. They just took me in front of court and said, this guy's a bad guy. The judge is going to say, well, what did he do? He said, well, he's just bad. Well, how is he bad? What did he do? Did he bite somebody? Did he rob a bank? What did he do? You've got to have an accusation. If you're going to have a criminal charge, you've got to charge him with something. You just can't charge the person with being a bad guy. And that's what they were trying to get away with. They expected Pilate to endorse their own decision in order of the death sentence, but Pilate begins a brand new trial. The Jews, on their mind, had already decided that Jesus was going to die. They didn't answer Pilate directly because they knew what their charge was, even though he would be guilty in a Jewish court, wouldn't hold a lot of merit in a Roman court. And it's just that simple. They didn't want to bring forth. We already went back to Luke, and they charged him with blasphemy. Blasphemy was actually the charge that they wanted to stick with Jesus, because that was enough in Jewish culture and Jewish tradition or law, whatever you want to call it, to convict him of death. Verse 31, then said Pilate unto them, take ye him and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, it is not lawful for us to put any man to death. So he's trying to put it back on them. Pilate was not concerned about judging Jewish affairs. Like I said, he nor Herod, either one, wanted to get involved in the Jews' drama and this whole thing. They had freedom to settle their own disputes, like we said before, but they wanted a judgment of death, but they needed to present a valid case before Pilate before he could put him to death. It's just, they don't have anything substantial here as far as the charge goes to be worthy of death. That the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die, is according to, I need to read those two together. Verse 31 and 32. Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death. Verse 32, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying what death he should die. Now Jesus had prophesied his own death, that he would hang, or that he would be lifted up. Both of those are nailed to a tree or lifted up. Nailed to a tree, that was more in the Old Testament prophecy along the lines of David and I can't remember the other one. But Jesus has said he would be lifted up on his death. Verse Deuteronomy 21:23, hanged on a tree is a curse from God. The Jewish punishment would be stoning, but he was going to be hanged on a tree. He was going to suffer the ultimate humiliation in his death, as far as the Jewish culture would go. Anybody that was hanged on a tree to die was considered cursed of God. But he was, like I say, he would be subject to the lowest humiliation he could suffer for our benefit. Verse 33, Then Pilate entered into the judgment hall again and called Jesus and said unto him, Art thou the King of the Jews? To claim to be the Messiah was to claim to be the promised King of Israel. And that's what Jesus' claim was. He was claiming to be the Messiah. That's what he had claimed the whole time. He never changed his story on that the whole time. And the Jews were trying to present this claim in a way that would lead Pilate to conclude that Jesus was a threat to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire saw anybody that claimed to be a king or was trying to start a movement that was rebellious or seditious to the Roman Empire would be worthy of their attention, and they'd put them to death. Pilate was, at this point, probably in disbelief that Jesus was a threat, because Jesus didn't have an army. He had followers that were meek and mild and only were interested in teaching about the philosophy of love and interaction that Jesus had preached. So Pilate and the Roman Empire didn't really see Jesus as a threat to them directly, because he didn't have an army. He wasn't raising an army. He was just going around preaching to be a morally good person. He was trying to get people to be morally good. So that was not a real threat to the Roman Empire. Jesus answered him. He asked him if he was king of the Jews. Jesus answered him, and he answered him with a question. Sayest thou these things of thyself, or did others tell it of thee? Tell it thee of me. That's what get it worded right. So is your question based on, Jesus is asking, is your question based on personal knowledge that I have made such a claim, or did others tell you that I claim to be king? Pilate didn't understand what kind of king Jesus was. He knew that he wasn't an insurrectionist king, like so many had been. They were trying to raise a rebellion against the Roman Empire, but he just couldn't figure it out. And Pilate answered in verse 35, I am, excuse me, am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priest have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done? So Pilate's trying to get a grip on what's going on here. He's trying to figure out what charge he can bring against Jesus so that they can satisfy the Jews or turn him loose, which is what he's wanting to do. No interest in Jewish affairs again, no knowledge of Jesus other than what he was told. Pilate knew that there was something behind the charges, or they would not hate Jesus so much, but he needed clarification on a charge, excuse me, to bring a verdict. He didn't really have any clear picture of what Jesus had done other than claim to be king of the Jews or claim to be their sought after Messiah. What hast thou done? Verse 35. Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered unto the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence. So this didn't help Pilate a whole lot, other than just to make it more clear to him that Jesus was not a threat. Jesus had addressed the charges that he was king of the Jews and said his kingdom is not like the Roman Empire. Basically what he was saying, my kingdom is not like the Roman Empire or any earthly kingdom. So it was no threat to the Roman Empire. Jesus didn't, we know that his kingdom was not envisioned as an earthly kingdom. And that's what threw the Jews off. If he had come down here and formed an army and ran the Romans out of Jerusalem, then he'd have been the king that they expected. But it was a spiritual kingdom. So it was not of this world, but active in the kingdom, made up of those who have conquered the world by separating themselves from it spiritually. So this was his kingdom, a spiritual kingdom of people that have separated themselves from worldly things and dwell on spiritual matters. So they were no threat to the Roman Empire.
While you're there, I read somewhere, I can't remember where, it's been years now, but I remember this statement, that prophets in that day were a dime a dozen. And so the historical record shows that there were many people, for money's sake, trying to get a dollar any way they could, were putting themselves forward as the Messiah. They knew that if they could garner a gathering, that they would support them. Like the guy you were talking about a while ago, they'll just wear out everybody. And when these people realize that they're false prophets and that they're not the Messiah, they done used got all the money they can, and preloaded off of them all they could, they move on. So I think that's one of the things that's a playing factor here. They're looking at Jesus, you're just another one of those that's he's taking advantage of these dim-witted people, that are looking for this time, and he's playing to their hand, and soon he'll wear them out and get all he can out of them, and that'll be the end of that too.
And
That's something to consider.
Yeah, I think having studied through this, though, I think Pilate was a whole lot like the men that came to get him at the garden. That when he stood up and said, I am he, they fell back. I think the presence, the authority that Jesus speaks with, and the authority, just his presence, his physical presence, and the fact that he's not afraid of anything, the way he carries himself. You can tell by the way somebody carries themselves when they walk in a room. A lot of times they're bearing, whether they're somebody that is bold and open, or somebody that's very mild and meek. Jesus, I think, intimidated people, not by putting on airs or anything, but just by the authority that he carried himself with when he walked in a room. With the authority that he carried himself with when they came to get him in the garden, and he said, here am I. He was bold about it. He wasn't shy. He knew what was going on. He knew what to expect. And it just shocked him. And I think Pilate falls into that category. I think he knows he's got somebody on his hands that could possibly be the king of the Jews. And he's afraid to make a call either way. He doesn't know what to do. He's afraid of the Jews, and he's afraid of Jesus. It's the way I read Pilate's actions here. He's just, plus on top of this, and I can't remember if I read it, but I don't remember if I read it in John or one of the other Gospels, because I read over the other Gospels to get a full idea of what was going on here. But Pilate's wife had a dream about this and told him, said, don't convict this, don't kill this man, don't have nothing to do with him, because I had a bad dream and things are not going to go well for us if you have anything to do with this. So Pilate, along with the other Romans, was very superstitious. And anytime they had a dream, his wife tells him a dream like this, it shook him. I'm sure it shook him. So he was in a situation where he was afraid of the Jews and what they would do, and he was afraid of Jesus. So he was in a dilemma. That's why he sent him to Herod. He was wanting to get rid of this and get it off his back and not have anything to do with it, but it just wouldn't leave him. He was the man that was going to make the decision one way or the other. And ultimately he tries to play it off on the Jews, but whose final decision was it really? It was Pilate's. The Jews wouldn't let him make any other decision, but it was still him that made the decision. Verse 37, Pilate therefore said unto him, art thou a king then? So, he asked him what he'd done, and he says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight that I should be delivered not be delivered to the Jews, but now is my kingdom not from hence? And Pilate, he's talking like a king. He's talking like a king. So Pilate says, therefore unto him, art thou a king then? And Jesus answered him, thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born. And for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. So how did he answer him? He taught factual information about God and of himself, enabling the people to become subjects of his kingdom. That's basically what he's telling Pilate. This is the reason I came into this world, to establish this spiritual kingdom. And these words are wasted on Pilate because he couldn't comprehend. So many of these people could not comprehend a spiritual kingdom. And honestly, I can see where they're coming from, because for so many years, the Jews had a king or a leader or something. It had always been a military force that had rescued the Jews from bondage or from their enemies. The Ark of the Covenant was with them. God was with them during battles. They delivered them from the Philistines and from the Moabites and from so many different tribes that tried to overtake them. And they never could. What always overtook the Jewish people and put them in bondage? Their neglect of God. That's the only thing that could overtake the Jews, the nation of Israel, was when they neglected God and forgot about God, then God woke them up. He let them go into bondage to wake them up and to make them spiritual. And then when they returned as spiritual people and prayed to God long enough, he'd deliver them. So that was an ongoing theme in the Old Testament of the Jews neglecting God, going into bondage, and then restoring themselves or bringing themselves close to God, and God delivering them from bondage. So they're looking for that same thing. They're looking for Jesus to be the earthly king, but he's come to set up a spiritual kingdom, and they can't understand that. So if they don't understand it, they try to kill it, which is common in man's nature. If you don't understand something, you try to destroy it or get it away from you. And that's what they were trying to do with Jesus. They were trying to destroy him because they just didn't understand him as king of a spiritual kingdom. Excuse me. Pilate saith unto him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews and said unto them, I find in him no fault at all. What is truth? That was, I think, kind of a cynical comment that Pilate makes to Jesus, because he's talking about bear witness of. He told him he came to bear witness of the truth, that everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice. I think he may have insulted Pilate, saying that if you don't hear my voice, you don't know the truth. And Pilate was kind of cynical, said, what is the truth? What is truth? So Pilate concluded that the Jews that Jesus was not a threat to the Roman Empire, and goes back out into the crowd and says, I find no fault in this man. I just find no fault. He understood that Jesus was not a threat. He had clearly made it up in his mind. Jesus is not here to destroy the Roman Empire. He poses no threat to us. The only threat he poses is to the political influence of the high priest and the Jewish council. I think he'd made that up in his mind. Verse 39, he offers them a way out. But ye have a custom that I should release unto you one at the Passover. Will you therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? So Pilate looked at, to satisfy the mob. What he wanted to do was find him guilty and grant him amnesty, so he'd pacify the priests and the mob. So he's made it up in his mind, I'll just find him guilty of whatever they're charging, blasphemy, whatever they're charging him of. We'll punish him and then turn him loose. That's what he made up in his mind to do. That way he thought in his mind, I can satisfy them that he's guilty and save face, and I can punish him and send him on his way. They did this to Paul and Peter and Paul so many times. They tell them, don't preach the gospel, and they whip them, beat them, and then send them on their way, and they go right out the door and start preaching in the street. So that's what Jesus would have done, but it was not going to happen. It was not going to happen. The Jews would not have it. And we have a reference, if you want to read about Pilate's wife's dream, it's in Matthew chapter 27, verse 19. These are the reference materials. I went to these to get all this in my head today. I'm telling you more than John's telling you, because John leaves a lot of this out that's in the Synoptic Gospels. To get a full grasp on everything that happened, you need to read all 4 accounts of it. But John's focus is something different. But like I said, we've read part of it also in Luke 23 and verse 18. But he had a plan to punish him and turn him loose. And that's what he thought would seal the deal and make everybody happy. In verse 40 then, cried they all again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So the Jews wouldn't have it. They didn't want, it was their custom, and we only learned that here. I believe we only read that here in John, that it was a custom, or in this account, that it was a custom of the Jews to, at Passover, turn one prisoner loose. The Jews were determined to kill Jesus. So Barabbas, and it doesn't say it here, but in Luke, let's turn back to Luke 23, in verse 19. It says, who for a certain, let's start in it. And they cried out all at once, saying, away with this man, and release unto us Barabbas, which is basically the same thing that John says in 39 or 40. Who for a certain sedition made in the city, and for murder was cast into prison. So he was a seditionist, a rebel. Sedition, it means he raised a rebellion, or rebelled against the Roman Empire, and he was a murderer. John doesn't tell us that, but Luke tells us he was a murderer. So they would rather see a murderer go than for Pilate to let Jesus go. So they cried again, saying, no, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. The Jews were determined to kill Jesus. Barabbas was a robber and a murderer and insurrectionist, a man who was guilty of the things that Jesus had been charged with. One of the things that they were trying to get the Roman Empire to kill him for was insurrection. He was raising a rebellion. They tried to put it forth as he was raising a rebellion against the Roman Empire. But Pilate has seen through that in that he was not raising an army to overthrow the Roman Empire, but merely raising a gathering of people that believed what he taught, his spiritual insight. That's what his insurrection was, a spiritual truth. And that's what he told Pilate in verse 37. He said, I should bear, I came into the world that I should bear witness unto the truth. So that was his sedation or insurrection was bringing forth the truth. We get into chapter 19.
Really 18. I didn't say it on the front. You're talking about the cleanliness
Mm-hmm.
and the traditions. We started out with the 10 commandments in Exodus, and then somewhere along the line with all the Levitical priesthood and all those sacrifices and altars and all that, the Jews ended up with 613 commands, 365 do nots, 213, 248 do's. But if you go to Leviticus chapter 15, you'll see where it starts talking about what they are to avoid, which would be them unclean.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the idea was what the Jews had done is to avoid even being able, because they even got spit on by a Gentile, they were unclean. Or they were
Right.
like a woman in her cycle, they couldn't sit where she had sat, or they were unclean. I mean, it's
Right.
that point in Leviticus chapter 15. And so, what do? You build a hedge, and that's what the traditions were. They built a hedge. We won't even go into the free authority. We won't even go in.
Right.
We won't be anywhere near them because they're unclean.
And if they had, even though they hadn't touched anything, if they just walked in the door and walked out, they would be considered unclean and couldn't take the Passover. It'd be 7 days before they could take the Passover. Yeah, when you said Leviticus, I started looking through my notes because I have a reference to Leviticus in a little bit farther in my, but yeah, that's fine. We ain't got but about 3 minutes anyway, but we're going to go ahead and get started. So they wanted Barabbas instead of Jesus, a murderer and an insurrectionist. They wanted him instead of Jesus. They were bound and determined to kill Jesus. They would rather have a murderer loose on the streets than somebody that proclaimed to be the Messiah and was bringing truth. A lot. Things hadn't changed as much as people think. Yep, that's it. It just this comes right around. That's why you don't need to destroy history, because if you read history, you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls that we've stepped in, into the past. If we can sidestep a lot of trouble. Absolutely. That is the truth. All right, chapter 19. Crucify him, my title for this day. Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. Whipped. Now, and in reading this, we're going to stop right here because what I'm about to say is going to cover the rest of our time. In reading this, the way it is accounted, it looks like I told you before, Pilate's plan was to beat Jesus and turn him loose, punish him and turn him loose. He had him scourged, and I think he had him, the way everything reads, it's possible that he underwent 2 different beatings. I think the first time he just had him whipped with rods and was going to turn him loose. And I think that's had him scourged, and the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put him in a purple robe. I think it's Mark or Matthew's count, it's a scarlet robe. But it could have been 2 different robes, because Herod's people put a robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. And then Pilate's people did the same thing to him. They beat him. So I couldn't get a clear picture of this. It's going to take a lot more study for me to figure this out. But it appears that Pilate may have had him beaten to turn him loose. And then when they decided that they would crucify him, he had him scourged, because a lot of times they would take prisoners that were going to be crucified and they'd scourge him, which means beat him with a whip with chains or metal or bone attached to the end. And they beat him near death so that it wouldn't take as long for them to die on a cross. And that's, I think, what they did with Jesus. I'm not sure on that. You need to study that for yourself a little bit to figure it all out. But that's the way it appears. I know that he was scourged so bad that he had to get somebody to carry his cross. he couldn't bear the weight of his cross. That's how weak he was after they scourged him. Go ahead. You're waiting on me to shut up to ring the bell? No? Okay. Well, I'm through. We'll start in chapter 19 next week. Thank you for your attention.